Somewhere in the weeks after this photograph was taken, one household in it packed a wagon for Missouri. The other 5 stayed exactly where they were, for years. That's the plain answer, and I want to give it to you early, because most of what gets said about this family starts by promising you an ending it hasn't earned yet. This one hasn't earned an ending yet either. But it has earned a beginning, and the beginning is a photograph, taken in Smet, South Dakota, sometime around 1894, of 6 people who, on that particular afternoon, were still, in every way that mattered, one family under one roof and one set of worries. Look at it the way you'd look at any old photograph you found in a drawer that wasn't yours, slowly, and without assuming you already know what you're seeing. 2 women and a man are seated. A man and 2 women are standing behind them. That's the whole cast. 6 faces, 6 sets of hands, 1 afternoon. The man seated in the middle is Charles Ingalls. He's somewhere in his mid to late 50s in this image. The exact number depends on which of 2 competing dates for this photograph you trust. A disagreement this film is about to walk into directly, and he has the look of a man who has spent most of his adult life doing physical work outdoors and has recently been asked to sit still for a stranger with a camera, which is its own kind of labour. Beside him is his wife, Carolyn, and beside her, seated as well, is their eldest daughter, Mary, blind since a childhood illness, in her late 20s here, dressed with the same care as everyone else in the frame, because a photograph like this one was not a casual errand. It was an occasion, even if we no longer know exactly what kind. Standing behind them are the 3 younger daughters. Caroline Carrie Ingalls, the middle daughter, a young woman who by this point in her life had already spent time working in a print shop, setting type by hand, a detail that will matter more than it seems to right now. Next to her, Laura Ingalls Wilder, though she wasn't using that second name yet in any way that would have meant anything to a stranger, because in this photograph she's simply a married woman in her mid-20s, a farm wife, a mother, standing with her own family of origin for what may have been one of the last ordinary days before her own household circumstances forced a decision. And beside her, the youngest, Grace, barely out of girlhood, watching a camera the way people watch cameras when they haven't yet had the chance to get tired of having their picture taken. Notice too who isn't standing in that row. Laura's own husband, Almanzo, isn't in this photograph. Neither is their daughter Rose, 7 years old at the time. That's worth naming plainly rather than letting it pass as an incidental gap, because a modern viewer, used to family photographs that mean everyone currently alive and related, can easily misread the absence as significant on its own. It very likely isn't. A studio portrait like this one in this period typically recorded a specific unit. Here, the household of origin, a father, a mother and their children, photographed as the family they had been raised inside, rather than every spouse and grandchild any of them had since acquired. Almanzo and Rose had their own household by 1894, a short distance across the same town, and their absence from this particular sitting is far more likely a matter of which family this portrait was understood to record than any statement about who mattered. It's a small distinction, but it's the kind of distinction this film keeps insisting on. Read what a photograph can actually tell you, and resist filling its gaps with a story that feels satisfying rather than one the evidence supports. Getting even this smaller unit of 6 people into one frame was not, in 1894, the casual half-second event a photograph is today. A camera working outside a big city studio in this period typically needed something like 1 to several seconds of complete stillness to properly expose a plate, part of why almost nobody in a photograph from this era is caught mid-laugh, mid-word or mid-motion. Subjects were told plainly to hold still, and a fidgeting child or a shifting adult could blur an entire sitting and force it to be redone. 6 people cooperating at once, holding that stillness together for however many seconds the light and the equipment demanded, is itself a small logistical achievement. One more reason to treat this as a planned occasion, rather than 6 people who simply wandered past a camera, even if we still can't tell you, today, exactly what that occasion was. 6 people, 1 photograph. And here is the first thing I want to tell you plainly, because this whole film only works if I'm honest about it from the start. We do not actually know with certainty the exact day this picture was taken. The date 1894 is the one you'll see attached to this image almost everywhere it circulates. On museum placards, in family trees typed up by well-meaning relatives, in commercial reproductions sold under that date. And around 1894 is very likely correct. The ages of the people in the photograph line up reasonably well with it. The clothing is consistent with the period, but there is at least one competing claim, a vintage news caption placing the sitting a few years earlier, closer to 1891. I don't have a documented account of the reasoning behind that earlier date, and I'm not going to invent one just to make the disagreement sound tidier than it is, so I'll say only what I can support. 2 dates circulate, they don't agree, and the balance of evidence favours around 1894. That's the date this film is going to use, with the word around left in front of it every time it matters, because pretending we know something we don't is exactly the kind of shortcut that turns real family history into folklore. We also don't know who took it. No photographer's name is written on the back. No studio stamp survives on the print that's typically reproduced. We don't know if this was taken in a professional studio in town, with a photographer who owned a camera and a backdrop, and made his living posing families just like this one, or whether it was taken by someone with a private camera, a neighbour, a relative, a passing acquaintance who happened to own the equipment, which by the 1890s was no longer only in the hands of professionals. And we don't know why. There's no letter that says, "We are having our photograph made on such and such a day for such and such a reason." No diary entry that mentions it. No record of an anniversary, a homecoming, a holiday, or any other occasion that would explain why, on this particular day and not another, all 6 of them ended up in the same room at the same time, dressed for the camera. That last part is worth sitting with for a second, because it's easy to assume a family portrait always marks something, a wedding, a departure, a milestone. Sometimes it does, but sometimes 6 people simply happen to be in the same town on the same week, and somebody thought, we should have a picture made while we're all here. We don't know which of those this was, and rather than invent an occasion for you, the way plenty of retellings of this family story are content to do, I'd rather tell you plainly, the occasion is unresolved. What we have is the print, not the reason. Here's something that might genuinely surprise you, if you've spent any time assuming this photograph is as thoroughly documented as everything else connected to this family. The Herbert Hoover Presidential Library, which holds a substantial share of the Ingalls and Wilder family's surviving papers and photographs under its Rose Wilder Lane collection, does not have this specific group photograph catalogued in its own public finding aids. What it does hold, catalogued and dated, is a separate solo photograph of Charles Ingalls alone, from roughly the same period, circa 1894. So the institution that has done more than almost any other single archive to preserve this family's paper trail has, on the record, a picture of the father alone from around this time, but not as far as its own public catalogue shows, this particular sitting of all 6 together. That doesn't mean the photograph is fake, or unimportant, or wrongly attributed to this family. It very clearly is this family, and the museums and historical sites that display it treat it as a settled and significant object. But it does mean that when you hear this photograph described as the only known photograph of the full Ingalls family together, and you will hear that because it's a claim repeated often and confidently, you should hear it the way I'm going to ask you to hear most bold claims in this film, as something a specific institution has said, not as a fact the historical record has independently proven beyond challenge. It's their claim. It's a reasonable one. It is not the same thing as a chain of provenance we can trace link by link back to a photographer's ledger. I'm telling you all of this not to undercut the photograph, but to do the opposite. To make sure that when we build a 2-hour film on top of it, we're building on something solid. A photograph whose exact date is a little uncertain, whose photographer is unknown, and whose occasion is unrecorded is still an extraordinary document. it's still 6 real, specific named people captured in one room at one moment before any of them knew what the next 3 decades were going to ask of them. It doesn't need us to invent certainty for it. It only needs us to look honestly at what it actually shows. And what it actually shows is a family that was, on this one afternoon, still whole in the most literal sense. 6 people, 1 household of origin, all within reach of each other. And that's really the only thing this photograph can honestly tell you about the moment it was taken. Not an ending. Not a warning. Not, despite what you may have heard elsewhere, the last time they were ever together. Because as you're about to hear, that isn't what the record shows at all. What the photograph shows is a pause, a single frozen instant inside a family that had already been through enough loss and hardship to fill several documentaries on its own, caught, for one afternoon, in a moment of simple, undramatic togetherness. No wagon outside, no goodbye being said, no one in that room, as far as any surviving record tells us, treating this as a farewell. Which makes what happened next worth taking seriously, because it happened quietly, and it happened to only one branch of this family, not all of it. Somewhere in the weeks and months after this sitting, the exact gap isn't precisely fixed, but it's a matter of months, not years. One of the 6 people in that photograph packed up a household and left Dakota behind for good. Laura, along with her husband Almanzo and their young daughter Rose, would be living in a different state by the fall of that same year, starting over on a piece of land they'd never seen before they arrived to buy it. That's real. That's documented. We're going to walk through exactly how and why in the next part of this film, with the deed itself, the debts that forced it, and the corrected details of a land purchase that a lot of retellings, including some right here on this channel, have gotten slightly wrong. But here's the part that tends to get lost, because the family scattered is a much punchier sentence than the truth. The other 5 people in this photograph did not leave. Charles, Caroline, Mary, Carrie, Grace. All 5 of them stayed in or near to Smet, the same town, in some cases the very same house, for years after this picture was taken. Not months, years. In Mary's case, more than 3 decades. So if you came here expecting a story about a family photograph followed immediately by a family disappearing in every direction, I want to correct that right now, at the start, rather than let you carry a wrong impression for 2 hours before I fix it. 1 household left, 5 stayed. And what happened to each of those 5, the work they took up, the marriages, the house that kept changing hands and changing shape around them, and eventually the losses that none of them could outplan, is the rest of what this film is going to spend its time on. Before we go further, I want to take 30 seconds, and only 30 seconds, for something this channel depends on. The research in this film, the deed records, the newspaper archives, the probate filings, the days spent confirming that a claim repeated 100 times online actually holds up against the paper trail, takes real time, and if it's useful to you, the best thing you can do is subscribe so the next one finds you without you having to look for it. I'd also genuinely like to know where this finds you tonight and what time it is where you're sitting. Drop it in the comments, because I read them, and it's the closest thing I get to knowing who's actually here with this family. If you want to go further than any single video can take you, there's a book bundle and an ebook drawn from years of this kind of source digging, and you can find all of it, along with everything else this channel has put together on this family, at prairiesecrets.com, linked in the description below and pinned in the comments. If you're watching on a television right now and typing that address isn't easy from where you're sitting, there's a QR code on screen. Point a phone camera at it, and it will take you straight there. That's the only ask for the next 2 hours. Thank you for spending this time with this family and this channel. However you'd like to listen from here, straight through in pieces over a few nights, or with your eyes already closed, I'm glad you're here. If you drift off before the end, that's all right. This one will still be here when you wake up. So let's go back to that photograph one more time, just for a moment, before we let it go for now. 6 people, 1 room, and in a matter of months, one of those 6 chairs, or rather, one of those 2 standing places, would be empty at family gatherings in Smet, not because anything happened to that person, but because she and her husband and their small daughter were about to do something that, for a family already worn down by fire, by paralysis, by drought and debt, was less a choice than a necessity. What it cost them, what it bought them, and what it meant that she left while the other 5 did not. That's where we're going next. Let's go back to Rocky Ridge, and to the 2 years before this photograph was ever taken, because you can't understand why Laura left when she did, without understanding what had already happened to her by 1894. In the spring of 1888, 4 years before that photograph, and while Laura and Almanzo were still building their own life together in Smet, Almanzo suffered what was diagnosed at the time as diphtheria, followed by a stroke-like paralysis that left him with permanently weakened legs and hands. He would recover enough to walk, to work, to farm, but not without a cane and not without pain for the rest of his life. In the language available to a country doctor in Dakota Territory in 1888, diphtheria and the paralysis that sometimes followed it were understood well enough to be named, but not well enough to be reliably treated. Recovery, when it came at all, came slowly and partially, and there was no procedure available that could restore what the illness had already taken from his legs and hands. This wasn't a passing illness. It was a physical condition that followed him into every decision the 2 of them made from that point forward, including the ones that show up later in this film. A farmer whose legs no longer fully obey him needs more help to do the same work, not less, and help on the Dakota Prairie in the late 1880s cost money the young couple didn't have. Then, in August of 1889, their house, the house Almanzo had built, the house where their infant son had died just weeks earlier, burned to the ground. What was saved amounted to almost nothing. A trunk, some bedding, a few tools, everything else, gone in an afternoon. Think about what everything else actually meant for a young farm household in 1889. The wedding china, if there was any. The stove. The bedding beyond what someone managed to carry out the door. The small accumulated inventory of a marriage's first 4 years. The kind of ordinary household objects nobody thinks to inventory until they're gone. Replaced afterward, one purchase at a time, on credit, by a couple who had just been told by a doctor a year earlier that the husband might never fully walk unassisted again. So by the time you get to 1894, the year of the photograph we've been looking at, you're not looking at a young couple who simply decided, on a whim, that Missouri sounded nice. You're looking at a couple who had, within the space of about 18 months, lost a child, lost a house, and lost the full use of one of their 2 working bodies. And behind all of that, quietly, for years, debt. Notes on land and equipment that Dakota's own drought-driven agricultural collapse in the early 1890s made almost impossible to pay down. Wheat that wouldn't come up, land that wouldn't hold value, a regional economy, not just a personal one, working against them. It's worth being specific about what drought-driven agricultural collapse meant for a household like this one, rather than letting the phrase pass as background noise. It meant a farmer planting a crop in the spring in good faith, watching the sky for weeks that didn't deliver rain, and bringing in, come harvest, not enough grain to cover what the bank was owed on the seed and the equipment used to plant it. A cycle that, reseated 2 or 3 years running across the same stretch of Dakota, emptied out whole townships of families who had arrived a decade earlier believing the land would hold. Some of Laura and Almanzo's own neighbours packed up and left for exactly this reason during these same years, which is part of why the Ozarks wasn't a random destination when the Wilders finally chose it. It was, by reputation at least, the opposite kind of ground, hilly instead of flat, wooded instead of open, and, the word that mattered most to 2 people who had just watched a prairie sky refuse to deliver rain for a second summer running, reliably watered. That's the pressure sitting underneath Laura's shoulders in this photograph, if you know to look for it. Nothing on her face tells you any of this. She's simply standing in a dress next to her sister being photographed. That's the thing about pressure like this. It very rarely shows up on film. It shows up in decisions made afterward, out of frame, months later, far away. In July of 1894, not long after, we believe, this photograph was taken, Laura, Almanzo and their 7-year-old daughter Rose loaded a covered wagon and left a Smet, heading south and east toward the Missouri Ozarks. We know a good deal about this specific trip because Laura kept a diary of it as she travelled. A real, physical, handwritten diary. The kind of primary source that this whole film depends on trusting over hearsay. And in it she recorded ordinary things. The weather, the condition of the roads, what they spent on feed and lodging, small kindnesses from strangers along the way. It is not a diary that explains why they were going. It doesn't need to. The why had already been decided back in Dakota, in the ledger of debts and disasters we just walked through. The diary simply records the going. They arrived in the Ozark Hill Country in the late summer of 1894, drawn there in part by advertisements and word of mouth describing the region as cheap, fertile and, critically, after what they'd just survived, reliably watered. Land that didn't depend on the same fickle prairie rainfall that had just helped ruin them. And on September 21st of that year, Laura Ingalls Wilder, not Almanzo, not the two of them jointly, but Laura by herself on paper, purchased 40 acres of rough, partly wooded land a few miles outside the small town of Mansfield, Missouri. I want to slow down on this deed for a moment, because it's one of the places where this film is going to gently correct something you may have heard, told a little differently elsewhere, including in other retellings of this same family's history. The sellers were a couple named Thomas and Charlotte White, not a bank, not an estate. An ordinary local couple selling a piece of land they already owned and had already begun improving. The property came with roughly 200 young apple trees already planted, along with something like 800 pieces of nursery stock already in the ground, which meant that whoever bought this land wasn't just buying dirt, they were buying a head start on an orchard someone else had already begun. The price was $400, a portion paid outright and the rest structured as an assumed mortgage the Wilders took on as part of the purchase, meaning the Whites' own existing loan on the property didn't simply vanish at the closing table, it transferred, so that the young couple signing this deed inherited someone else's debt, along with someone else's apple trees, and owed a payment schedule they hadn't personally negotiated from scratch, which tells you plainly that this was not a cash windfall. It was a young family, recently burned out and recently disabled and still carrying debt from Dakota, taking on a new debt in Missouri in order to get out from under the old one. That's not romantic, it's arithmetic. But it's the arithmetic that built what would eventually become Rocky Ridge Farm, those first 200 trees and the 800 pieces of nursery stock that came with them, becoming, over the following decades of this couple's working lives, the foundation of an orchard operation that would eventually support the household in ways that first uncertain deed could never have promised. The Whites, September, the assumed mortgage. These details matter, because other versions of this story, including at least one earlier video on this very channel, have gotten the seller and the terms wrong, and a documentary that has already promised to care about the paper over the folklore owes you the correct paper here. And the deed itself names Laura alone, not Almanzo Wilder and wife, which was an extremely common formulation in property records of this period, one you'll find on countless other deeds from the same decade. Just Laura. This detail gets picked up sometimes as evidence of something dramatic, an implied statement about their marriage, or about Almanzo's capacity given his health, or about some early flicker of the independence Laura would become known for decades later as a writer. I want to be careful here, because the deed itself doesn't tell us why it was written that way, and a single honest sentence is enough to say so. It may reflect Almanzo's condition, or how the couple managed money, or simply how the local land agent chose to draft it that day. Nobody wrote the reason down, and I'm not going to pick one explanation and dress it up as fact. What we can say, confidently, because it's right there on the paper, is the fact itself. On September 21st, 1894, one name appears on the deed to this land, and it's hers. A plain, dry, legal fact that outlasts every guess anyone, including this film, might make about what was in either of their heads that day. So, by the fall of 1894, Laura's household existed in a different state than the rest of her family. Not a different town, a different state. Hundreds of miles of largely unbroken travel away from Smet by the standards of the day. A route close to the same ground Laura's own diary covers, week by week, wagon wheel by wagon wheel. No easy Sunday visit, no quick trip home for a holiday. A journey like that meant days of hard travel, real expense, real advance planning. For a family that had just spent its remaining resources buying land and paying down debt, that kind of travel wasn't casual. It had to be earned, saved for, chosen deliberately, and that fact alone tells you something about what distance actually meant for this family in the 1890s, long before telephones or automobiles closed the gap the way they eventually would. What did exist, and what this family used instead, was the mail. A letter between Smet and Mansfield in the 1890s could move in days rather than weeks, riding the same expanding rail network that had made both towns possible in the first place, which meant that even after Laura's household stopped being reachable in an afternoon, it never stopped being reachable at all. Distance, for this family from 1894 onward, didn't mean silence. It meant something slower and more deliberate. News that arrived by letter instead of by walking next door. A relationship maintained across weeks instead of days, but maintained all the same. This is the moment, if you're keeping the photograph in mind the way I asked you to, where one of those 6 chairs, or standing places, actually does go empty. Not symbolically, literally. The next time there was any kind of family gathering in Smet, Laura would not have simply walked over from wherever she'd been living in town, the way she might have a year earlier. She would have had to travel from another state to get there, and there's no evidence she made that particular trip in the months immediately following the move. No letters, no notice in the Smet paper marking a homecoming. Nothing to suggest she came back that first winter or the one after it. The physical arrangement captured in that photograph, 6 people, 1 household of origin, all within easy reach of each other, was now, for the first time since any of them could remember, no longer true for all 6 at once. And here is exactly where I want to correct the shape of the story before it gets away from us, because it would be very easy, at this point in the film, to let that single fact stand in for the whole family's fate. To let you walk away thinking that photograph marks the moment everyone scattered to the winds. That is not what the record shows. It shows the opposite, in fact, for the other 5 people in that print. Charles was still in Smet. Caroline was still in Smet. Mary, blind, unmarried, entirely dependent on her parents' household, was still in Smet. Carrie, working in town, was still in Smet. Grace, finishing her schooling, was still in Smet. 5 out of 6 of the people photographed in that room were, as far as any surviving record tells us, living within a few blocks of each other, in the same town, for years to come, in some cases for the rest of their lives. The family did not scatter in 1894. One branch of it did. And I think that distinction matters more than it sounds like it should, because the family scattered is the kind of sentence that flattens a specific, documented one household departure into something that sounds like a general dissolution, and the paper trail simply doesn't support that reading. What Laura's departure did do, and this is worth sitting with honestly, rather than either inflating it into tragedy or shrinking it into a footnote, is create the first real geographic asymmetry inside a family that had, up to that point, always moved together. When Charles Ingalls had uprooted his family in earlier decades, from Wisconsin to Kansas to Minnesota to Iowa to Dakota Territory, they had gone as a unit, all of them, parents and children alike, packed into whatever wagon the family owned at the time, chasing the same land, the same opportunity, the same uncertain promise, arriving together and leaving together, decision made by the father and lived out by everyone under his roof. Laura's move to Missouri broke that pattern for the first time. She wasn't travelling with her family of origin anymore. She was travelling away from it, toward a household of her own, with her own husband and her own daughter, making her own decision about where the next chapter of her life would happen. A decision shaped by Almanzo's health and their shared debt. Yes, but made, ultimately, by the two of them. Not by her father, not by a family consensus, not by anyone standing in that photograph beside her. That's not a small thing, even if it isn't the dramatic rupture some retellings want it to be. It's the ordinary universal moment every family eventually faces when a grown child's household stops moving, in step with the household they came from. A moment that happens quietly in nearly every family that has ever existed, usually leaving no trace anyone thinks to keep. Except this family's version of that moment happened to be recorded, almost by accident, in a photograph taken just months before it happened, which is exactly why that photograph is worth the 2 hours we're spending on it. So Laura is now hundreds of miles away, building an orchard on borrowed money and land that wasn't fully paid for, with a husband whose body would never fully recover, and a young daughter who would grow up mostly outside her grandparents' daily reach. A daughter who, decades later, would end up the very person routing this family's letters, diaries and photographs into the archive this film keeps returning to. That's her story from here forward, and this film will return to her, to the Missouri years, to what Rocky Ridge slowly became, to the long relationship she kept, at a distance, with the sisters who stayed, later on. But for now, I want to leave her there, on that new land in the Ozark Hills, in the fall of 1894, and turn back to Smet, because 5 people are still standing in that house, and the store that had supported them for years was, at almost exactly this same moment, failing underneath them. Charles Ingalls had run the store in Smet for a stretch of years by the time this photograph was taken, and by the mid-1890s that store was not merely struggling, it was gone. This wasn't unique to Charles. The early 1890s across Dakota Territory and the new state of South Dakota were years of drought, of collapsing wheat prices, of small-town merchants watching customers who couldn't pay their accounts and couldn't be pressed to, because pressing a neighbour who had nothing wasn't the kind of thing this particular town did to itself. Store after store on Main Street folded or changed hands during those years. Charles's went the same direction. The building, the shelves, the ledger of names and unpaid balances, all of it wound down, quietly, the way most small failures do, without a headline, without a single dramatic afternoon you could point to and say, this is when it ended. A store like Charles's ran, in practice, on credit extended both directions, merchandise bought on account from suppliers further east, and goods sold on account to neighbours who'd settle up after harvest, if the harvest came in. When enough of those neighbour accounts stopped being collectible, because the wheat simply wasn't there to sell, the store's own debts to its suppliers didn't go away with them. That's the ordinary, unglamorous mechanism behind the store failed. Not one bad decision, but a chain of small, honest debts running through half the county that stopped balancing. What's worth sitting with is what Charles did next, because it tells you something about a man who was, by the time of that photograph, already in his late 50s, with a household that still depended on him and no store left to run. He didn't retire. There wasn't really a version of retirement available to a man in his position in 1890s Dakota. No pension, no savings cushion built during the good years, because there hadn't been enough good years in a row to build one. Instead, Charles pieced together a living out of whatever the town of Smet and the surrounding county actually needed done. And it turns out a small county seat needed quite a lot done by quiet, trusted, literate men who'd been around long enough to be known. He served as a justice of the peace, and, for a period, as a deputy sheriff for the county. Small-town legal and civic work, more about settling boundary disputes and serving papers and keeping order at gatherings than anything resembling the frontier lawman work that era had already mostly left behind. A justice of the peace in a county seat this size wasn't handling murders or grand theft. He was hearing the small, constant friction of people who had to keep living next to each other regardless of who was right. A debt one neighbour swore had been paid and another swore hadn't. A fence built a few feet onto the wrong side of a property line. A dispute over a wagon damaged while borrowed. It's unglamorous work, and none of the specific cases Charles heard have survived in any record this film could locate. But the office itself is documented, and it tells you something plain about how the town regarded him even after the store failed. They still trusted him to render a fair decision about their money and their land, which is not a small thing to hand a man whose own finances had just visibly come apart. Alongside that, he worked as a peddler for a stretch, and he went back to carpentry, the trade his hands had known since he was young, the same skill that had built more than one house this family had lived in, across 4 states and territories, now put to work for wages, house by house, job by job, for other people's houses instead of his own. Picture what that actually looked like, week to week. A man who had once owned his own store, walking to a neighbour's farm with a peddler's pack, or bent over a workbench framing someone else's porch, or sitting at a small desk hearing 2 farmers argue over a fence line, then walking home in the evening to a house that was, by any honest measure, running on less money than it had running through it even 5 years earlier. None of these jobs paid what the store once had, even in the store's leaner years. What they offered, together, was survival. The same instinct that had carried this family across a continent's worth of moves when Charles was younger, except now the moving had stopped and the improvising had to happen in place, inside one house, inside one town, because there was nowhere left that made more sense to go. That's not failure exactly. It's adaptation, forced by circumstance, carried out in full public view, in a town too small to let anyone's change fortunes go unnoticed, and none of it seems to have broken the family or driven anyone out of the house. Charles kept working. Carolyn kept the household running around him. Mary, Carrie and Grace stayed exactly where they were, in the same rooms, under the same roof, while the family's economic floor quietly shifted beneath all of them. What that shift required, in practical terms, was more hands contributing income than the household had needed a decade earlier, when one store and one storekeeper had been enough, and Carrie and Grace, the 2 still living at home, each answered that need with a trade of her own, in the years right after this photograph was taken. Carrie's answer was the print shop, the same hand-composing work we've already mentioned, setting type backward and reversed, letter by metal letter, pulled one at a time from a typecase and locked into a composing stick line by line. For a Smet newspaper, skilled and disciplined labour in an era when the honest range of paying work available to an unmarried woman in a small Dakota town was still genuinely narrow. Grace's answer, a little younger and a little later, was a teaching certificate, the well-worn path that would put her in sole charge of a one-room county schoolhouse, responsible for reading, arithmetic, discipline, and keeping the stove lit through a Dakota winter, following almost exactly the path her older sister Laura had walked a decade earlier, before Laura's own marriage and departure. Neither trade came with fanfare. Both went straight into the same household ledger that Charles's peddler's pack and carpentry wages were going into. One family, several incomes, none of them large, all of them necessary, and, without either sister quite intending it that way yet, both of them building exactly the kind of independent skill that would, years later, let each of them build a life at some real distance from 3rd Street, on her own timeline, not her parents'. A teaching certificate in this period and place typically meant a short normal school course, rather than a full college degree, followed by a county exam, and it qualified a young woman for genuinely demanding, genuinely solitary work, sole charge of every subject, every age group in one room, for a term's pay that ran to a few $100s at most, out of which she was often expected to board with a local family rather than live independently. It was not an easy trade, and it was not a well-paid one, but it was hers, earned on her own certificate, answerable to a school board rather than to a parent, and it put Grace, like Carrie before her, in charge of something specific and her own for the first time. Let's stay with that house for one more year before we let it go, because 1901 is where the next thread starts, and it starts with a wedding. On a specific day in 1901, in the parlour of the same 3rd Street house, very possibly the same room where, several years earlier, 6 people had once arranged themselves for a photographer none of us can name, Grace Ingalls married a young man named Nathan Dow. I want to be careful with that word possibly, because it's doing real work in that sentence. The house is the same house. The family is the same family. It would be a small, satisfying detail to tell you that Grace stood for her vows in the exact spot where her father once sat for a camera, and I would love to tell you that, because it's the kind of image that makes a documentary feel complete. But the surviving record doesn't specify which room the ceremony took place in, and it doesn't give us a guest list. We don't have a newspaper account naming who was in that parlour that day, whether Laura made the trip up from Missouri for her youngest sister's wedding, whether Carrie stood beside Grace, whether the neighbours who'd bought flour and thread from Charles's old store years earlier came by to wish the family well. What we have is the fact of the marriage itself, the date, the names, the county record confirming it happened. And I'd rather hand you that plain fact than dress it up with a guest list I invented to make the scene feel fuller. The wedding is confirmed. Who stood in the room is unresolved. Both of those things can be true at once, and I think you deserve to know exactly where that line falls. A parlour wedding of this kind, in a town like Smet in 1901, wasn't a smaller or lesser version of a church ceremony. It was, for a family of this standing, an entirely ordinary way to be married, often with a local minister brought in to perform the service in the family's own front room, furniture pushed back against the walls, whatever chairs the household owned supplemented by borrowed ones from neighbours for the day. It's the kind of occasion this film would love to place Laura at, or Carrie, or any of the other 3 faces from that photograph, and I've told you honestly that the record simply doesn't let me. What it does let me tell you is that Grace was marrying into exactly the kind of life her own parents had built a generation earlier. A working farm, a Dakota winter, a husband whose labour and whose health would determine, in ways neither of them could have predicted that day, where they'd be living 20 years on, a pattern this family had already lived once, in Charles and Caroline's own marriage, now beginning again, quietly, in the next generation. Nathan Dow wasn't from De Smet originally. He'd come out to South Dakota the way a lot of young men did in this period, looking for land and a foothold, and the 2 of them settled in these early married years into farm life together, the ordinary next chapter for a young couple of their time and place, a house to build or buy, land to break and plant, the same basic pattern Grace had grown up watching her own parents live out, except now it was her name on the marriage record instead of Caroline's. I want to hold Nathan's health in your mind here, because it's going to matter a great deal later in this movement, and it would be dishonest of me to spring it on you without warning. Nathan Dow had asthma, not a minor seasonal inconvenience, but a chronic condition serious enough that it would, within about 2 decades, make it genuinely difficult for him to keep doing the one thing a farmer's body is required to do every single day without exception, which is work outdoors, in dust, in chaff, in the particular airborne misery of a working farm in every season, threshing time especially, when the air over a Dakota farmyard fills with exactly the kind of fine grain dust that a compromised set of lungs handles worst. That's not a detail I'm introducing for drama. It's in the record, and it's the reason the next part of this story happens the way it does. Keep it in your pocket. We'll come back to it. For now, though, in 1901, Grace and Nathan are a young married couple building an ordinary life, and I want to leave them there for a moment and turn to Carrie, because Carrie's path outward from that 3rd Street house looked almost nothing like her younger sisters, and it deserves to be told on its own terms. You'll remember Carrie from earlier in this film, the sister who went to work in a Smet print shop after the photograph, setting type by hand for the local newspaper, a trade that gave her a small independent income of her own. In the first decade of the new century, she used exactly that independence to do something neither sister standing beside her in that photograph did. She went out to the Black Hills, near the small settlements of Top Bar and later Phillip, and filed a homestead claim in her own name, a single, unmarried woman claiming land on the same terms the law allowed a man, required to live on it, work it, and prove it up to the land office before the title became hers. That took years of solitary work on harder ground than de Smet's, without a husband's labour to share it. By around 1907 or 1908, Carrie had done it, proved her claim and held clear title to land that was simply hers. Carrie married in 1912 at Rapid City, 34 years old, and a proven landowner in her own right before she ever signed a marriage certificate. Her husband, David Swansea, was a widower with children of his own, and the couple settled near Keystone, South Dakota, a Black Hills town whose own local history would later credit Swansea with a role in naming the granite peak that became Mount Rushmore. Local tradition, not documented certainty, so I'll leave it exactly that plainly. What matters here is simpler. Carrie now had a household, a husband, stepchildren, and a home a couple hundred miles removed, geographically and in the daily rhythm of visiting from the house where that photograph had been taken 18 years earlier. So here is where the two younger sisters in that photograph stand, if you draw the map honestly, by the early 1910s. Grace, married, had stayed close, still in the de Smet area, still within the orbit of her aging parents' household. Carrie, married, had gone out to the Black Hills and built a life a couple hundred miles removed. Two sisters standing next to each other in that old photograph, close enough in the print that their shoulders very nearly touch, and 2 decades later, living lives that had spread out across a meaningful stretch of South Dakota, one still nearby, one genuinely far. It would be easy, at this point in the story, to let that stand as the whole picture, to say simply that the family kept scattering a little further with each passing decade, the way a stone thrown into water sends its rings out wider and wider until they fade entirely, and for a while that reading would even be defensible. But then something happens in 1919 that complicates it in exactly the way good history is supposed to complicate a tidy story, because it isn't a further scattering, it's the opposite. Remember Nathan Dow's asthma, the detail I asked you to hold on to a little while back. By the late 1910s, that condition had become serious enough that farming, the trade Nathan and Grace had built their married life around, was no longer something his body could reliably sustain. Years of dust, of chaff at threshing time, of the ordinary airborne conditions of working land for a living, had worn on lungs that were already compromised, and at some point in this period, the Dows gave up the farm. At almost exactly the same time, Carolyn Ingalls, Ma, the woman seated beside her husband in that photograph a quarter-century earlier, was growing old alone in the 3rd Street house. Charles had been gone for years by this point. We're going to spend real time with that loss and its long particular aftermath in the movement right after this one, because it deserves its own full telling rather than a passing mention here. For now, what you need to know is only this. By 1919, Caroline was an aging widow, still sharing the house with her blind, unmarried elder daughter Mary, and the daily physical work of keeping a household running, the hauling, the heavier chores, the simple presence of someone else capable-bodied under the same roof, was more than 2 women, one of them elderly and one of them without sight, could easily manage entirely on their own. So in 1919, Nathan and Grace Dow moved into the west rooms of the 3rd Street house. Picture what that actually meant in practice, in a house that had been built decades earlier for a smaller, younger household than the one now trying to fit back inside it. 2 adults who had just given up an entire working farm, Whatever furniture, tools, and livestock a farm household accumulates over 18 years of marriage had to be sorted into what could be sold, what could be stored, and what could be carried into a set of rooms in someone else's house. Nathan, a man whose lungs had just cost him his own land, was now living under his mother-in-law's roof, dependent in a way a farmer of his generation wasn't raised to expect to be. Caroline, in turn, gained back the kind of daily help, carrying water, splitting kindling, the physical maintenance an aging widow and a blind daughter couldn't easily manage alone. That the household had been quietly missing since Charles died 17 years earlier. It was not a reunion arranged for sentiment. It was a practical solution to two separate, unrelated problems: a sick man's ruined livelihood and an old woman's failing strength, that happened because this was a small town and a close family to solve each other. Whatever Nathan and Grace felt about giving up a farm they'd built their entire married life around, the record doesn't preserve it, and this film isn't going to invent it for them. I want to slow down on this because it's the single most important correction this movement has to offer, and it's exactly the kind of detail that gets lost when a story insists on telling you, again and again, that a family scattered. Here is a household that 25 years after our photograph was taken had already lost one daughter to Missouri and another to the Black Hills, a household that, by every surface measure, looked like a family spreading further apart with each passing year. And then, in 1919, part of that same family moved back in, not symbolically, not as a visit, as a documented, dated change in who was actually living under that roof. Nathan's asthma made his own farm untenable. Caroline, aging, needed more hands in the house than she and Mary alone could provide, and the solution the family arrived at was to consolidate, not to disperse further. Grace and her husband packed up whatever a farm household packs up when it gives up farming, and they moved into rooms in the same house Grace had been married in 18 years earlier, the same house that had once held all 6 of the people in that photograph at once. This is worth naming clearly, because it's the kind of fact that a lazier telling of this family story would simply skip past. It doesn't fit the shape of a tragedy, and it doesn't fit the shape of a triumph either. It's just true, and it's true in a way that pushes back, gently but firmly, on the whole idea that this family story after 1894 is simply one of increasing distance. Laura left for Missouri. Carrie left for the Black Hills. Those departures are real, and this film has told them to you honestly, without softening them. But the household that photograph came out of did not simply thin out year after year until nothing was left of it. It contracted, expanded, and reconfigured. Daughters leaving, and then, when circumstances required it, a daughter and her husband coming back, moving into the very rooms of the house their own wedding had once filled with whatever guests we can no longer name with certainty. That's the honest shape of what happened to this family in the 2.5 decades after that photograph was taken, and it's worth saying plainly, because it's more useful than either of the 2 easy stories you could tell instead. Not a family staying perfectly together, frozen the way the photograph itself might tempt you to imagine, and not a family simply scattering the moment the shutter closed, never to be gathered under one roof again. It's the same handful of names moving in and out of the same rooms across a quarter century, the walls of that 3rd Street house holding a shifting, living arrangement of people rather than a single fixed portrait. And that, finally, is where we have to turn our full attention to the person whose absence, by 1919, had already reshaped everything about that house for 17 years, the man seated in the middle of that photograph, whose death in 1902 is the loss this whole family had already been quietly rebuilding itself around by the time Nathan and Grace carried their belongings into those west rooms. We've walked around the edges of it twice now, mentioning it only enough to keep our timeline honest. It's time to go back to 1902, sit inside that loss properly, and follow exactly what it cost the household that was left to carry it forward. Charles Ingalls was 66 years old in the spring of 1902, and by then the store had been closed for the better part of a decade. The peddler's pack and the carpenter's tools and the justice of the peace's docket had all in their turn been picked up and set down again as his body allowed. and the household on 3rd Street had settled into whatever rhythm 5 people find when the youngest is grown, and the work has gotten smaller instead of larger. He had outlived a store, outlived a section of prairie he'd once tried to farm, outlived, by this point, more moves than most men of his generation attempted in a lifetime. What he had not outlived, and what nothing in this family's long habit of picking up and starting over could fix, was his own heart. The record we have is plain and clinical in the way death records from this period usually are. Charles Ingalls died on June 8, 1902 in the 3rd Street house of what his death record describes in terms consistent with heart disease, cardiovascular failure, in the language a modern doctor would use, though the certificate itself uses the older, plainer words of its time. He was buried in the Smet cemetery with a Masonic funeral, which tells you something worth pausing on for just a moment. A Masonic funeral in a town this size followed its own set order. Lodge brothers processing together, the specific rites of the order performed graveside rather than left to a minister alone, a formal acknowledgement in front of the whole town that the dead man had belonged to something beyond his own household. The Masons were not a ceremonial afterthought in a town like De Smet. Membership meant you had been, for years, a known and vouched for man among your neighbours, the kind of man other men trusted enough to sit beside in a lodge hall and call brother. Whatever the store's failure had cost Charles Ingalls in income, it had not cost him that. The town that had watched him lose his shop, watched him take up peddling and carpentry and small legal errands in his 50s, still turned out to bury him with its full and formal respect. I want to be careful here about a detail that gets repeated often enough, in enough places, that it has hardened into something close to accepted fact, when the honest truth is that it isn't settled at all. You may have heard, somewhere else, a version of this scene that includes Laura, that she got word of her father's failing health in Missouri, made the long trip back to Dakota, and arrived at his bedside just in time. It's a moving detail. It also traces, as far as I can find, to narration in another documentary about this family, not to a letter, a diary entry, or a contemporary newspaper account. Nothing Laura herself wrote down. So I'll tell you plainly. Whether Laura reached her father before he died is unresolved. Not false. It's entirely possible it happened and simply wasn't the kind of thing that made it into a surviving written record, but not confirmed either, and a film that has spent this much time correcting other people's confident-sounding claims about a deed in Missouri or a photograph's date owes you the same caution here, at the moment that matters most. What we can say with confidence is what happened to the house and to the 2 women left inside it. Caroline was 65 when Charles died. Mary was 35, blind since 14, unmarried, and without an income or a piece of property that was legally hers. Charles's death removed the one name that had anchored the household's finances for decades. Mary's vulnerability wasn't about what the law generally allowed women to do. By 1902, an unmarried adult woman could hold property and inherit in her own name, same as any man. It was narrower. No income of her own, no legal claim yet established, dependent entirely on however her mother's estate eventually happened to be divided. If Caroline died without a will, or with one that simply split the house among however many children were living, Mary could have ended up with a fractional interest in a home she couldn't sell and couldn't count on outright. That's the specific practical risk a document drawn up a decade later would go on to solve. Caroline inherited the house, as was standard, and she and Mary continued living in it together, now alone in a home that had once held 6. They kept themselves fed and housed for the next 2 decades, the way many single-income widows' households in a rail town did. Boarders, laundry taken in for other families, and, this is the detail worth keeping, fly nets, the woven mesh coverings horse owners needed through the Dakota summer, made and sold by hand. Mary, blind since childhood, made them too, working by feel rather than sight, earning her own place in the household's economy with her own hands rather than simply being cared for inside it. But a household held together by boarders and laundry and handmade fly nets is also an inescapably fragile arrangement, and Caroline knew it. If she died first without making any specific provision, the house, the one asset standing between Mary and total dependency on whichever relative could take her in, would pass through ordinary inheritance and probate, with no particular obligation to protect a blind, unmarried daughter's right to keep living in it. So in 1912, in her early 70s and still capable of signing her own name to the fix, Caroline walked the problem into a lawyer's office and settled it years ahead of the need, rather than leaving it for a deathbed decision. The terms of that 1912 transfer are documented in the county's own property records. Caroline Ingalls transferred title of the 3rd Street house to Mary, and the consideration recorded, the thing that makes it legally a sale rather than a gift subject to different rules, was $1. $1 and love and affection. It's a recognised legal formula for transfers between family members, not Caroline's own invention, but knowing that doesn't make it any less pointed a thing to find in this family's paper trail. A widow in her 70s moving the single largest asset she had left, deliberately and permanently, into the name of the one daughter who had no husband, no independent property, and no legal protection waiting for her otherwise. That's paperwork functioning exactly as care ought to, when care alone isn't enough to keep a roof over someone's head. Caroline and Mary continued in the house together for another 12 years after that transfer, the boarders and the laundry and the fly nets continuing alongside them, the household's small economy holding steady even as its 2 remaining members grew older. Then, in the winter of 1923 into 1924, the record turns quieter and more sombre. What survives from that final season describes Caroline as feeble, a plain, period-appropriate word, not a diagnosis, but a word chosen by whoever was describing her at the time to mean exactly what it says. A woman whose strength was visibly, steadily leaving her. Caroline Ingalls died on April 20th, 1924, Easter Sunday that year, at 84 years old, in the same house she had lived in, most of those years with Mary beside her, for well over 3 decades since the photograph that opened this film. She had lived on in that house for more than 2 decades after Charles, long enough to see a daughter married in her own parlour, a son-in-law and daughter moved back into rooms down the hall, and a household economy rebuilt twice over out of boarders and laundry and handwork, without ever once, as far as any surviving record shows, giving up the house itself. I want to flag one more honest gap here rather than paper over it. No source this film located confirms, one way or the other, whether Laura made the trip from Missouri for her mother's funeral. It's the kind of absence or presence question this film has tried to answer plainly, wherever the record allows it. And here, for once, the record simply doesn't say. I'd rather leave that gap visible than fill it with an assumption in either direction. Here is where I have to be honest with you about a gap in the record that I was not able to close, no matter how far into the paper trail I went looking, and I'd rather tell you that plainly than smooth it over with a confident sentence that isn't actually earned. With Caroline gone, Mary, now in her mid-50s, blind, and for the first time in her entire adult life without her mother in the house with her, needed somewhere to live and someone to help see to her care. The sources disagree in ways that don't fully reconcile about exactly how that unfolded in the 4 years between Caroline's death and Mary's own. One line of evidence suggests Mary spent some period during these years in Manchester, South Dakota, a small town not far from Smet, possibly staying with or near relatives there before her situation resolved further. Another line of evidence points toward Mary remaining in or near the Smet house itself, which by this point, remember, already had Nathan and Grace Dow living in its west rooms, the very household reconfiguration we discussed a little earlier, the family moving back together rather than further apart. It's entirely possible both are true in sequence, a stretch of time in Manchester followed by a return to Smet or something like it, but I don't have a source precise enough to hand you a clean, confident timeline of exactly which came first, or for how long, and I'm not going to invent one just to make this section of the film flow more smoothly. What every source agrees on is this. At some point in these years, the responsibility for Mary's daily care passed to her sisters, to Grace, already resident in the family house, and eventually decisively to Carrie, out in the Black Hills. By 1928, Mary was living with Carrie and David Swansea in Keystone, South Dakota, the Black Hills mining town, roughly 150 miles west of Smet, that Carrie had made her home since her marriage 16 years earlier. However, the intervening years had actually unfolded. This is where Mary's story comes to its end. She died in Carrie's home in Keystone at the age of 63. And even here, at the very last fact this movement has to offer you, the record refuses to hand us a perfectly clean answer. Some sources give her date of death as October 17th, 1928. Others give October 20th. The difference is small, 3 days, and it changes nothing about the larger shape of what happened. The cause is more settled than the date, a stroke, followed by pneumonia, at 63. Some sources give her date of death as October 17th, 1928. Others give October 20th. The difference is small, 3 days, and it changes nothing about the larger shape of what happened. But I'd rather tell you the discrepancy exists than pick whichever date sounds more authoritative and present it to you as settled fact, because that's exactly the kind of quiet, unexamined confidence this film has tried, for 2 hours now, not to traffic in. What happened after Mary's death is, in its own way, the clearest single image this movement has to leave you with. Her body was not buried in Keystone, in the town where she had spent her final years and where she died. It was returned by rail, roughly 150 miles back to Smet, back to the same cemetery where Charles had been buried 26 years earlier, back to the town where she had lived for most of her 63 years, back to the ground her family had already claimed. Someone made that arrangement. Someone decided that whatever else had shifted and scattered and reconfigured in this family across 3.5 decades. A daughter in Missouri, a daughter in the Black Hills, a house that had passed from father to mother to daughter, borders and laundry and handmade fly nets, standing in for a store that no longer existed. Mary belonged, in the end, back in Smet. So look at where that leaves the photograph now, the one we opened this film with, the one this movement has been quietly working toward all along. Charles, seated in the middle, gone since 1902. Carolyn, seated beside him, gone since 1924. Mary, seated on Caroline's other side, the whole seated row of that photograph, the row closest to the camera, the row you'd naturally look at first, is now, as of October 1928, entirely gone. Not scattered, not distant. Gone, in the plain, final sense of the word, from the house, from Smet, from the world these 3 younger sisters were still living in. What's left, standing where they once stood behind their parents in that print, are 3 women. Carrie, back in Keystone, having just seen her blind sister through her final illness in her own home. Grace, still in the west rooms of the 3rd Street house alongside Nathan, in the town where all of this happened. And Laura in Missouri, more than 3 decades and several states' worth of travel, removed from a house that, by the time this movement ends, no longer holds a single one of the people who raised her. The house on 3rd Street is still standing in 1928. It's still legally in the family, Mary's ownership secured by that 1912 deed, presumably passing onward through whatever arrangement the sisters made among themselves, though the record doesn't require us to chase that particular thread any further for this film to make its point. But it is no longer, in any meaningful sense, the house the photograph was taken in. The centre that photograph recorded, Charles and Caroline and Mary seated, steady, present, has stopped being an address you could travel to and finished being something else entirely. A set of graves in a Smet cemetery, a deed in a county courthouse file, and, increasingly, a set of memories carried by 3 sisters who are about to discover that their family story was no longer only theirs to keep. The house itself would eventually follow the same basic path this whole film keeps tracing for the objects connected to this family, from private possession into public keeping. It remained occupied by family through the rest of these years, and decades later, long after every one of the 6 people in that photograph was gone, it passed out of family hands entirely. bought in 1967 by a memorial society formed specifically to preserve it, opened the following year as a museum, and listed in 1975 on the National Register of Historic Places, a formal government acknowledgement that this particular house, on this particular street, in this particular small Dakota town, mattered enough to the country's history to be protected as a piece of it. The rooms where a family once fed boarders and Mary's fingers once worked a fly net by feel are today rooms a visitor can walk through and look at, the same way you might look at the photograph itself in an archive folder in Iowa. The house didn't stay a home. It became a document, the way the print in this film's opening scene became a document, kept now for reasons that have very little to do with why anyone originally built it or sat for it. Let's go back to that photograph one more time, because this is the last time this film is going to ask you to look at it directly before the end, and I want you to look at it differently than you did at the start. At the start, it was 6 living people. By the spring of 1932, it was 3. Charles had been gone 30 years, Carolyn 8, Mary 4. Half the room that sat for that photograph around 1894 no longer existed anywhere except in that print, in a cemetery in Smet, and in whatever the 3 remaining sisters carried in their own memories. And it was that spring, in April of 1932, in a hospital room in Huron, South Dakota, that this family's private photograph began, for the first time, to become something else entirely, a story other people could buy. Little House in the Big Woods was published that April. It was Laura's first book, written when she was in her 60s, after a long career writing for farm journals and doing the ordinary unglamorous work of a rural columnist. Nothing in her earlier decades particularly announced that she would end up as one of the most widely read writers this country produced about its own settlement. The book told the story of a much younger version of the family this film has spent hours with. Ma, Pa, Mary, Laura herself as a small child, the Wisconsin years before any of the moves that would eventually put 6 people in a room in Smet for a photograph none of them thought to date. It was written for children. It sold. And within weeks of its release, a copy of it made its way into a hospital room in Huron, about 60 miles east of Smet, where Grace, the youngest of the 6 people in that photograph, now in her mid-50s, was a patient. The record doesn't tell us why she was hospitalized that particular spring, and I'm not going to guess at it. A contemporary newspaper account, the kind of small local item a Huron paper might run about a hometown author's family, records that Carrie, Grace's older sister, the one who had learned to set type by hand in a Smet print shop decades earlier, came to that hospital room and read the new book aloud to her, not summarized it, not mentioned it in a letter, sat with her sister, opened the book, and read it to her, chapter by chapter, the way you'd read to someone who couldn't easily hold a book herself, or whose eyes weren't up to the work, or who simply wanted the sound of a familiar voice carrying a familiar family across the room to her. The record doesn't specify exactly why the reading happened that way rather than another. What it does confirm is the scene itself. Carrie, book in hand, Grace in a hospital bed, and between them, in print for the first time, the childhood both of them had actually lived. Sit with that for a second, because it isn't a small thing. This is not 2 strangers picking up a bestseller. This is one woman reading to another woman a description of their own mother churning butter, their own father playing a fiddle by a fire, their own family's actual remembered life, now fixed in sentences chosen by their sister and shaped, edited, and in places quietly softened for a child reader by their sister's daughter Rose. Whatever Grace and Carrie thought privately, hearing their own girlhood handed back to them as a published book, the record doesn't let us say, I'm not going to invent a reaction that wasn't written down, but the fact of the scene is enough on its own. 2 of the 6 people who had stood or sat for that Smet photograph were, in the spring of 1932, sitting together in a hospital room while the 3rd surviving one of them had just turned all of their childhoods into literature, and the newspaper item that preserved this scene for us survived, in its own small way, for exactly the same reason the photograph did. Someone thought it worth writing down, and someone else, decades later, thought it worth keeping. And here's the detail I think earns this movement its title. more than any other single fact in it. 3 of the 6 people in that photograph had already died before that book existed at all. Charles never read a word of it. He'd been gone 30 years by the time it was published. Caroline never held it. She died 8 years before it came out. Mary, blind since childhood, could never have read it with her own eyes in any case, but she was gone 4 years before the question could even arise. Little House in the Big Woods was not a family memoir written, while the whole family was still there to weigh in on it. It was written into an already thinned room. Half the people who could have told Laura whether she'd gotten some detail of that Wisconsin cabin right or wrong were no longer alive to be asked. More books followed quickly after that first one, and I think it's worth walking through them the way you'd walk through a shelf, one spine at a time, because laid end to end against this family's own death dates. They tell you something no single volume tells you on its own. How much of the audience for this family's story was, at every stage of its publication, no longer the family itself. Farmer Boy came out in 1933, the year after Big Woods, telling Almanzo's childhood rather than Laura's, by which point Charles, Carolyn and Mary had already been gone for years, and Carrie, Grace and Laura were the only 3 left who could have opened it. Little House on the Prairie followed in 1935, on the banks of Plum Creek in 1937. By the Shores of Silver Lake in 1939, the volume that finally brought the story to Dakota Territory itself, to the region where 3 of the 6 people in that photograph were already buried, and where 2 more were still living the ordinary lives the book was, in its own fictionalized way, beginning to describe. The Long Winter followed in 1940. Little Town on the Prairie came out in 1941, the same year Grace died. The record doesn't let us say with certainty whether it reached her before or after, and I'm not going to guess at which. What it does let us say is this. By the time readers across the country were picking up that volume in bookstores and school libraries, having no idea that any of the people in it had ever been real, exactly 2 of the 6 people in the photograph this whole story is about were still alive to have read it themselves. 2 years later, in 1943, the 8th and final original volume, These Happy Golden Years, carried Laura's own courtship and wedding into print, and by then even Grace was gone, which meant only Carrie and Laura remained of the 6, one of them writing the story, the other one out in Keystone, reading whatever new volume arrived the way any other reader might, except that she had actually lived the events on the page. Lay it out like that, one publication date at a time against one death date at a time, and you can see something the books themselves never say out loud. This was not a shared family project, checked and confirmed chapter by chapter by everyone who'd lived it. It was one surviving sister's memory, published in installments into a family that kept getting smaller with almost every volume that came out. Each new book meant, for whichever of the 6 people happened to still be alive when it appeared, another chapter of their own life, or their parents' and older sisters' lives turning up in bookstores and libraries across the country, read by children who had never set foot in South Dakota and would never meet a single person who'd actually lived through any of it, and, with each passing volume, fewer and fewer people left who could have told those children whether it had really happened quite that way. The record makes something else clear here too, and it directly contradicts an idea that tends to attach itself to this family's story without much scrutiny. The notion that once Laura left for Missouri in 1894, and once she became a public author decades later, she effectively receded from her sisters' daily lives, present only on the page, a name in a byline rather than a woman who still came home. Through the 1930s, while those books were being written and published one after another, Laura and Almanzo made documented return trips to South Dakota, real, physical journeys, hundreds of miles each way, undertaken, the surviving photographs indicate, specifically to see Carrie and Grace. The Hoover Presidential Library holds images from at least one such trip, dated by the library's own caption to the later 1930s, and Laura's own later writing about her travels, pages that surfaced only after her death, describing these same roads and these same returns, references more than one trip back over these years. The exact count and the precise year of each individual crossing aren't pinned down with full certainty in the sources available to this film, so I'll leave it at what the record does support. Not a single isolated visit, but a pattern of them, repeated across the decade, an aging couple choosing, more than once, to point a car north and east instead of simply mailing a letter. It's worth being honest about why a trip like that had become possible at all by the 1930s, when it hadn't been in 1894, and worth being specific rather than vague about it, since specifics are what this film has tried to deal in from the start. Scholarship connected to the Pioneer Girl Project places the number of documented return trips at 3 separate crossings back to South Dakota across the decade. Not one sentimental detour late in a long life, but a repeated choice, made 3 separate times, to point a car north and east instead of simply mailing a letter. The exact date of each individual crossing isn't pinned down with full certainty in the sources available to this film, so I won't pretend to hand you a day-by-day itinerary. But 3 trips, independently documented, is enough on its own to retire the idea that this was a single nostalgic exception. Part of what made 3 trips possible, rather than none, is simply the books. Royalties that, however modest by later standards, were real income arriving on a schedule the orchard alone had never reliably provided. Part of it is a fact this film isn't going to dwell on, because it belongs to a different documentary already told elsewhere on this channel. But that deserves more than a passing mention here for honesty's sake. Their daughter Rose, established in her own writing career by this point, had been sending her parents something like $500 a year starting in 1921. Regular, structural money, not an occasional gift. And in 1928 went further still, building her parents a modern stone house on the Rocky Ridge property itself, complete with conveniences the original farmhouse had never had. None of that changes what the trips themselves meant. It only explains, in plain economic terms, how a couple who'd once left Dakota with barely enough to cover a mortgage 40 acres were able, a few decades later, to simply get in a car and go back 3 times in 10 years. Think about what that actually required in the 1930s. This wasn't a quick weekend errand. It meant days on roads that were, outside the larger towns, often unpaved, unreliable, subject to weather that could strand a car for a day or more. It meant an aging couple, Laura in her 60s by this point, Almanzo in his 70s, still carrying the legs that had never fully recovered from his paralysis 40 years earlier, choosing more than once to make that drive rather than simply let a letter or a royalty check stand in for their presence. These aren't studio portraits commissioned for publicity. They're the ordinary snapshots of people visiting family, which is exactly what they were. This deserves to be said plainly and without hedging, because it's one of the clearest corrections this film has to offer against a version of this story that gets repeated more often than the record actually supports. Laura did not simply leave in 1894 and become, from that point forward, a distant name who sent books instead of showing up. She left in 1894. That much is true, and this film told you so, honestly, in its second movement. But leaving is not the same as staying gone. Across the following decades, and especially once the books had made travel financially possible, in a way it hadn't always been for a young orchard-keeping couple carrying debt from 2 states, Laura kept returning to the town and the sisters she'd left. Not constantly, not in a way the record lets us count trip by trip with full precision, but repeatedly, documented, deliberately. A woman in her 60s and 70s choosing the discomfort of a long automobile trip on uncertain roads, because 2 of the 5 faces that used to stand near hers in that Smet photograph were still there to be visited. That fact reframes something important about the book's role in all of this. It would be easy, and I think dishonest, to tell you that Little House in the Big Woods and the volumes that followed it were what kept the family together once distance and death had thinned it out, some tidy sentiment about stories bridging the gap that geography couldn't close. That's not quite right. It flattens something the record actually shows to be more interesting than that. The books didn't replace the family relationship. They ran alongside it. Laura was publishing new installments of her sister's shared childhood. At the same time, she was climbing into a car and driving hundreds of miles to sit in a room with them. The public version of the story and the private ongoing relationship behind it were happening simultaneously, not one instead of the other. Grace didn't live to see the series finished. She died on November 10th, 1941, at the age of 64, of complications from diabetes, 9 years after that hospital room in Huron, and with several more of the books already published by the time she went. The record doesn't require, and this film isn't going to manufacture, some elaborate scene around her final illness. I'll give it to you the way it deserves. A date, an age, and the plain fact that with her death, only 2 of the 6 people in that 1894 photograph remained. Carrie, still in Keystone. Laura, still in Missouri, still writing. Nathan Dow, Grace's husband, outlived her by not quite 3 years, dying in May of 1944 and buried beside her in the same Smet cemetery that already held her parents and her sister Mary. Carrie outlived her younger sister by not quite 5 years, dying on June 2nd, 1946 at 68, also of complications from diabetes in the Black Hills town that had been her home since 1912, the same town where she had taken in Mary for the last months of Mary's life. Her will left her own homestead land, the ground she had proved up alone before her marriage, to the local Freemasons to help fund their Keystone Lodge, the same fraternal order that had buried her father with full honours in Smet 44 years before. I want to flag one thing plainly rather than let it pass as a pattern it isn't. Grace and Carrie both died of diabetes-related causes, 5 years apart, but Charles died of heart disease, and Caroline's death record doesn't specify diabetes at all. So I'm not going to manufacture a family medical through-line the evidence doesn't actually give me. With Carrie's death, the count that began this movement at 3 now stood at 1. Laura Ingalls Wilder was, as of June 1946, the only living survivor among the 6 people who had sat or stood for that camera around 1894. Everyone else in the photograph, her father, her mother, her blind older sister, her middle sister, her youngest sister, was gone. 2 years after that, in 1948, Laura wrote a letter, and this is a place where I can hand you her own words directly, rather than my paraphrase of them, because the letter survives and the phrase is hers, not mine. Like the diary, like the photograph, it didn't stay entirely private forever. It eventually found its way into a published collection of her correspondence. One more piece of this family's paper trail that ended up preserved and read by strangers long after the person who wrote it had any say in the matter. She wrote that she and Almanzo were still homesick for Dakota. Still. In 1948. More than 50 years after the wagon left Smet for Missouri. 4 decades after Rocky Ridge had become the only home her own daughter Rose had ever really known. 2 years after the last of her sisters had died, and 7 years after the one before that. Still homesick, in her own handwriting, for a place she had chosen, deliberately and for good reason, to leave in 1894. I don't want to build more out of that sentence than it can honestly carry. It's one line from one letter, and I don't know. No one does, because she didn't write it down. Every private layer of feeling that produced it. It could be homesickness for the physical prairie itself, the particular light and weather and horizon of Dakota, entirely apart from any person still living there. It could be something closer to what the word usually means, a longing for a place because of who used to be findable in it. The letter doesn't specify, and I'm not going to tell you it does. What I can tell you, confidently, because the date is right there next to the words, is when she wrote it, after both of her surviving sisters had already died, after the last possible destination for one of those long automobile trips back to South Dakota no longer existed to be driven to. By 1948, there was no one left in Smet or Keystone for Laura to visit. The homesickness, whatever exactly it was made of, had nowhere left to be answered. And that's really where this movement ends, because it's where the family, as a living, visitable, physically reachable group of people, actually ends. From 1946 onward, there is no configuration of any 2 of the 6 people in that photograph still alive together anywhere. Not in Smet, not in Keystone, not in Mansfield. The arrangement the camera caught around 1894, 6 people, one household of origin, close enough to touch, had already been impossible to fully recreate since Charles's death in 1902, and impossible in any partial form at all since Carrie's death 44 years later. Laura lived on alone among the 6 for another 11 years after that, into 1957, long enough to see the series she'd started in a hospital-adjacent hush, in 1932 become something close to a permanent fixture of American children's reading. But she lived those last years as the only person left who could look at that photograph and actually remember, rather than simply be told, what the room had sounded like that afternoon. It's worth being honest about what that means, and what it doesn't. It does not mean the photograph was some kind of curse, or that anything about the picture itself caused what happened to the people in it. The debts, the paralysis, the fire, the failed store, Charles's heart, Caroline's long widowhood, Mary's blindness, the fly nets and the borders, and the deed written for $1, and love and affection, Nathan's asthma, the homestead out past Philip, the hospital room in Huron. None of that traces back to a camera shutter closing on an ordinary afternoon into Smet. The photograph didn't do any of it. It only recorded a moment before all of it happened, the way photographs always do, whether the people in them go on to live another 60 years together or scatter within the month. What the photograph actually gives us, and all it was ever honestly going to give us, is a fixed point to measure everything else against. 6 people, 1 room, 1 afternoon, and then, over the following half-century, marriage by marriage, deed by deed, death by death, book by book, everything that came after. By 1946, everything that could come after, for 5 of those 6 people, already had. What was left was the 6th, and what was left, after her, was the print itself, and the story built out of it, which had, by then, already stopped belonging only to the family that made it. Laura died on February 10th, 1957, at Rocky Ridge, in the same house she and Almanzo had built up slowly, room by room, over more than 60 years on that first 40 acres bought from Thomas and Charlotte White back in 1894. She was 90 years old. Almanzo had died 8 years earlier, in October of 1949, at Rocky Ridge, the same land, worked and reworked for more than half a century by legs that had never fully recovered from the paralysis of 1888. 61 years after the diagnosis that could easily have ended his working life decades sooner than it did. So by the time Laura's own life ended, she had already spent nearly a decade as a widow herself, in the same farmhouse, on the same land, writing occasional letters, answering fan mail from children who'd never know her as anything but the name printed on the spine of a book. With her death, the count this movement has been quietly keeping since 1902 finally reaches its end. All 6 people in that De Smet photograph, Charles, Carolyn, Mary, Carrie, Grace, Laura, were gone. I want to stay with that fact for one more moment before we move past it, because it's easy to let a sentence like that slide by without really landing. 63 years separate the afternoon that photograph was taken from the winter Laura died. 63 years is a long time by any measure, longer than most of the marriages, careers and homesteads this film has walked you through. And for every one of those years, at least one of the 6 people in that print was still alive somewhere, still capable, in theory, of being asked what that afternoon had actually been like, who had arranged it, why the 6 of them had put on their good clothes and stood still for however long the old cameras of that era required. For 63 years the photograph had living witnesses. After February of 1957, it didn't. That's the hinge this final part of the film turns on. Not a tragedy. Nothing about a 90-year-old woman dying in her own home after a long, full life asks to be treated as one. Just a fact, plain and mechanical. The last person who could have looked at that print and told you something no document could tell you was no longer there to ask. So what happened to the photograph itself? once there was no one left in that family who could speak for it? The honest answer is less dramatic than you might expect, and that's exactly why it's worth telling carefully. The photograph didn't vanish. It didn't get lost in an attic, rediscovered decades later in some tidy cinematic twist. It moved, the way most family papers and images eventually move once the family itself is gone, into the hands of institutions, archives, libraries, museums, whose job is not to feel anything about a photograph, but to catalogue it, preserve it, and make it available to whoever comes looking next. A meaningful share of the Ingalls and Wilder family's surviving papers, photographs, and personal effects passed, over the second half of the 20th century, into the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in West Branch, Iowa, an unlikely home at first glance, a presidential library holding the private papers of a farm family from Dakota territory, until you remember that it was Rose Wilder Lane, Laura and Almanzo's daughter, whose own career and connections eventually routed a great deal of this material there. Rose spent much of her adult life active in political and literary circles that put her in touch with the kind of institutional world a farm couple in the Ozarks never moved in. Connections that, whatever else they meant for her own complicated career, meant her family's papers ended up somewhere with the staff, the climate control, and the cataloguing discipline to keep them intact for the long run, rather than scattered piecemeal through an estate sale or left to decay in a series of relatives' attics. The library holds it under what's catalogued, in its own finding aids, as the Rose Wilder Lane collection. The same collection this film mentioned earlier, back when we first went looking for our photograph in the library's public records and didn't find it listed as its own catalogued item, the way the solo photograph of Charles alone from the same period is. That's still true here at the end. What survives instead, in that collection, is Rose's own paper trail, her mother's manuscripts, her mother's letters, and eventually her mother's diaries, one of which brings us to the second half of this photograph's afterlife. It's worth pausing on the irony of that gently, without making more of it than it deserves. The daughter whose own role in shaping her mother's books has already been argued over at length elsewhere, is also, separately and less contentiously, the reason any of this family's private paper trail survived in an organised, accessible form at all. You'll remember the diary Laura kept during the 1894 journey from Smet to Mansfield, the handwritten record of weather, road conditions, the price of feed and lodging, the small kindnesses of strangers along the way, which gave us the closest thing to a first-person account of the very departure that opened Movement 2. It's a small book, by any account plainly kept, not a writer's manuscript, not composed with an audience in mind, just the daily accounting. A woman on a long, uncertain wagon trip might keep to steady herself. How far they travelled that day, what the horses cost to feed, what a night's lodging ran when they couldn't camp, a note here and there about someone along the road who'd been kind to a stranded family passing through. It reads, by every account of it, like exactly what it was. Not literature, just a record, written by a woman who had no way of knowing that the 7-year-old riding in the wagon with her would grow up to help build an entire literary career out of memories like these, and that this particular notebook, the plainest and least polished thing she ever wrote down, would end up outlasting her by 68 years before anyone else read it. That diary was never intended, as far as any evidence tells us, for publication. It was a private travel record, the kind of thing a young wife might keep to mark a hard journey, meant for no reader beyond herself and perhaps her own family, if she ever chose to show it to them. Laura did not publish it in her lifetime. She wrote 8 novels drawn loosely from her childhood and young adulthood, reworked and reshaped for a child reader, edited alongside Rose, but the 1894 diary itself, the actual document in her own handwriting, unfiltered by decades of retrospective shaping, stayed unpublished. It came out in 1962, 5 years after Laura's death, under the title On the Way Home. Rose edited it, supplied the framing material, an introduction, a closing essay reflecting on her mother and the family she'd grown up in, and shepherded her mother's private travel diary into a public book for the first time. Laura did not choose to publish this diary. She kept it. She may have intended to someday. There's no surviving statement from her either way, and I'm not going to invent one. What we know for certain is that the decision to bring it into print, to select what stayed and what didn't, to write the framing that would tell readers how to understand it, was made after Laura could no longer weigh in on any of it. It was Rose's decision, made about her mother's private words, 5 years into a world that no longer contained her mother to ask. It wasn't the only time that would happen either. Laura had written another manuscript in her later years, a more polished narrative covering the first 4 years of her marriage to Almanzo. The diphtheria, the fire, the debts, the same run of disasters this film walked you through in its second movement, but told in her own voice, as fiction close enough to memoir to blur the line. She never published it. It surfaced only after her death, and it reached print in 1971, nearly a decade after On the Way Home, and 14 years after Laura herself was gone, edited into a final volume by Rose's own literary heir, a man named Roger Lee McBride, who had inherited the rights in the unpublished papers when Rose died in 1968. By 1971, then, every one of the 8 books that made this family famous, plus this final 9th volume, plus the travel diary, had all reached the public, and not one of the 6 people in that Smet photograph, and not even the daughter who'd edited and shepherded so much of it into print, was still alive to see the shelf complete. This is the same basic pattern the photograph itself follows, and it's the real answer to the question this final movement is built to ask. Once every one of the 6 people in that print was gone, the family's own record, its photographs, its letters, its private diaries, stopped being something the family controlled. It became something an institution catalogues, something an editor frames, something a library shelves under a collection name drawn from the one family member who happened to have the archive-worthy career and the connections to make sure any of it survived being scattered to strangers in an estate sale. Rose herself died in 1968, 11 years after Laura, and after Rose's own death, whatever she had personally kept, including, presumably, prints of this photograph and the original manuscript of the diary already published 6 years earlier, passed onward again into the custody chain that eventually delivered a meaningful share of it to Hoover's archive in Iowa, where it sits today, available to any researcher, any documentary crew, any curious visitor who fills out the right request form. There's a smaller, quieter parallel to this worth mentioning briefly. The Laura Ingalls Wilder Historic Home and Museum in Mansfield, Missouri, holds, among its own collection, a pair of earlier tintype photographs of 2 of the Ingalls sisters from decades before our 1894 print. Small, dark, formal images from an even earlier stretch of this family's life. The kind of photograph few families of modest means could afford more than once or twice in a generation. Those tintypes didn't arrive at that museum by any grand donation from a distant archive. They passed, according to the museum's own account, from Carrie to her stepdaughter, Mary Swansea Harris, a young woman who came into this family not by blood but by Carrie's 1912 marriage to David Swansea, and who ended up, decades later, holding physical images of blood relatives she'd only ever known as her stepmother's family, and only later from that stepdaughter's family into the museum's keeping. It's the same basic story our own photograph and Laura's own diary eventually followed, just on a smaller scale and a longer private timeline before the institution took over. A family keeps its own images for as long as it has family left to keep them for. Then, eventually, whether after 5 years or 50, it doesn't anymore, and something else takes over the job. It's worth being clear at this late point in the film that there isn't one single Ingalls archive holding everything, a detail that matters if you ever go looking for any of this yourself. The Laura Ingalls Wilder Historic Home and Museum sits in Mansfield, Missouri, on part of the original Rocky Ridge land, and holds material centered on Laura and Almanzo's own decades there. The Laura Ingalls Wilder Memorial Society operates a separate museum in Smet, South Dakota, built around the Ingalls family's earlier years and the surviving buildings connected to them, including the 3rd Street house itself. And the Hoover Presidential Library, hundreds of miles away in West Branch, Iowa, holds a different slice again. The Rosewilder Lane collection, weighted toward Rose's own papers and whatever of her parents' material passed through her hands. 3 institutions, 3 states, 3 different fragments of one family's paper trail, each preserving what happened to come into its keeping rather than the complete picture any of us might wish existed in one place. That fragmentation is itself part of the honest answer to what happened after this photograph. Not a single vault holding the whole story, but pieces of it, scattered across exactly the kind of distance this film has spent 2 hours describing happening to the people themselves. That's the whole answer this final movement has to offer to the question its title asks. What did the photograph keep? Not a family. Families don't get kept, not the way objects do. They live, they move, they marry, they die, one date at a time, exactly the way this film has spent the last 2 hours tracing, one deed and one certificate, and one letter at a time. What the photograph kept was itself. A single flat rectangle of paper, chemically fixed at some point around 1894 by a photographer whose name nobody wrote down, in a room nobody described, for a reason nobody recorded, outlasting every single person who stood or sat in it, outlasting the house on 3rd Street, outlasting the store, the deed, the fly nets, the boarders, the wedding, the funeral, the drive back from Missouri, the reading in the hospital room in Huron. Outlasting all of it, and ending up, of all places, in a climate-controlled archive named for a president none of the 6 people in it ever voted for, sorted under the name of a granddaughter. Most of them never lived to see grow old. I want to bring you back, one last time, to the print itself, not as an abstraction, not as a symbol, but as an actual physical object, because that's where this film has to end. One more thing is worth knowing about how this particular image reaches you tonight, because it's part of what after this photograph actually means right up to this moment. The original print, taken around 1894, is old enough now to sit well outside the reach of copyright. Nobody owns it, in the legal sense, the way a photograph taken last year would still be owned by someone. That's precisely why it circulates as freely as it does, on museum walls, in the opening frames of documentaries like this one, reprinted without needing anyone's permission, because the law simply stopped protecting it decades ago. The colorized versions of it that have started showing up more recently, tinted, sharpened, sometimes even slightly retouched, are a different matter. Someone made specific creative choices to produce those versions, and whatever rights attached to that work belong, at least in part, to whoever did the coloring, in a way the black and white original never will again. It's a small, almost bureaucratic footnote to a 2-hour film about a family, but it's also a genuine part of the answer to this film's own question. What happened after this photograph, all the way up to the version of it you may have seen on a screen tonight, is that it slowly stopped being anyone's private possession at all, and became something closer to public property, free for any of us to look at, altered by hands none of the 6 people in it ever met, precisely because there is no one left with any legal claim to say otherwise. A single print, reproduced now countless times, on museum walls, in commercial reproductions, in the opening frames of documentaries exactly like this one. But somewhere behind all those reproductions, an original negative or an original print, aging the way all photographs from this era age, the paper stock slowly going brittle at the corners, the image itself made with the chemistry available in the 1890s, gradually losing contrast the way all photographs from that period eventually do, kept now under glass or in an acid-free folder by people whose entire job, whatever archive they work for, is specifically to make sure that process happens as slowly as science allows. It will keep aging regardless. That's simply what photographs do, no matter how carefully they're stored. This one has already outlasted by decades every single person it depicts, and it will very likely outlast whoever is watching this film tonight as well. 6 faces. Charles seated in the middle, his hands workers' hands, resting the way a man's hands rest when he's been told to hold still and doesn't quite know what to do with them. Caroline beside him, Mary beside her, blind, dressed with the same care as everyone else, looking as she looks in every surviving photograph of her, exactly like a woman participating fully in an ordinary family occasion rather than a woman apart from it. And behind them, Carrie, Laura, Grace, 3 young women standing close enough that their shoulders very nearly touch, the way sisters stand in nearly every family photograph ever taken, in nearly every family that has ever existed. None of them knew, standing there, what the next 63 years actually held. That's not a dramatic flourish. It's simply true, the way it's true of every photograph ever taken of every family that has ever posed for one. Laura didn't know that within months she'd be standing on raw, half-cleared land in the Missouri Ozarks, signing her own name alone to a deed for 40 acres she'd never seen a season on. Charles didn't know he had 8 more years left to work, to serve, to sit on the bench as justice of the peace. Caroline didn't know she had 30. Mary didn't know that a piece of paper her mother would sign a decade later for $1 and love and affection would matter as much as it eventually did. None of them knew about a hospital room in Huron or a book with their mother's hands in it, published into a family already down to half its original number. None of them knew, standing in that room, dressed for a camera whose operator none of us can name, that this would be the last time a camera would ever again find all 6 of them in one frame. I want to be careful with that last sentence, because it's the closest this film has come, in 2 hours, to the very claim I told you at the very beginning I wasn't going to make without proof. So let me be precise about what the evidence actually supports and what it doesn't. We cannot prove, and this film has not claimed, that this was the last time these 6 people were ever physically together in one room. The record doesn't rule out a later gathering we simply have no surviving trace of. A Christmas, a summer visit, some ordinary afternoon in the mid-1890s that nobody happened to write down or photograph. What the research behind this film does support, and I want the hedge to sit right beside the claim rather than a sentence or 2 later. As far as the archives and collections this film has checked, there is no later group photograph showing all 6 of them together. Only solo portraits, married couple portraits, photographs of Laura and Almanzo decades later on their return trips to Dakota, photographs of Carrie's household in Keystone, but never again, as far as any archive holds, this particular arrangement, this particular 6 in this particular configuration, on film. That's a smaller claim than the last time they were together, and it's also a truer one, and truer claims are the only kind this film has tried to make. What the camera caught, on an afternoon we can only approximate to within a few years, in a room nobody described, for a reason nobody recorded, turned out to be the only surviving image of something that would never again exist in quite that shape. Not because anything broke it on purpose, not because the photograph itself caused anything at all, but because that is simply what happens to every family eventually, photographed or not. People move for land. People move for health. People marry into new households and move back into old ones when illness or age asks them to. People die, in their own time, in their own houses, of ordinary and undramatic causes, leaving behind decks and deeds and diaries that outlive them by decades. The Ingalls family's version of that ordinary universal process happened to leave behind an unusually rich paper trail, deeds with exact dates, a diary of the exact road out of Dakota, a newspaper account of a sister reading a book aloud in a hospital room, a letter with the word homesick written in it 54 years after a wagon left town. Most families don't leave that kind of trail behind. This one did, largely because one of the 6 people in that photograph turned out to be a writer, whose work made an entire country curious enough, decades later, to go looking for the rest of it. So here, finally, is what the photograph kept and what it didn't. It didn't keep the family together. Nothing does that. Not really. Not for any family. Across 63 years and 3 deaths and 2 states. and one blind sister's 34 years in a single house, and one book series that turned a private childhood into public property. What it kept was simpler and, in its own way, sturdier than any of that. It kept the fact that they had once all been in the same room. 6 people, dressed carefully, standing still for however many seconds the light required, in that room in Smet, South Dakota, sometime around 1894. Not, as far as the paper trail can prove, the last time, but the last time anyone thought or happened to keep a record of it. Everything this film has told you since happened after that shutter closed. None of it was caused by it. The photograph didn't do anything to this family. It simply happened to be there, in that one room, on that one afternoon, doing the one thing photographs have always been able to do, and nothing more, holding still what everything else, eventually, always lets go of. It is still there now, wherever a copy of it hangs or sits today, on a museum wall in Smet, in a folder in an Iowa archive, in a book, in a documentary, in whatever screen you're watching this on tonight. Look at it again, if you have it open somewhere. Not for what it proves, because by now you know how little that actually is. Just look at it the slow way this film asked you to look at it 2 hours ago. 6 faces, 6 sets of hands, one afternoon, in a room nobody wrote down the name of, on a day nobody thought to date precisely. That turned out, against all the ordinary odds of a family this large and this scattered by circumstance, to be worth keeping anyway. 6 faces, one room. One afternoon that none of them standing there could have known was already quietly the last one anybody would think to keep. Good night.